Hello, everyone. My name is Rajdeep Singha, and today we are going to be talking about designing for open source applications. So, I am an open source enthusiast and currently I'm studying UX design. And on the Linux world, I maintain an app called Communique, which is an RSS feed reader designed for elementary OS. And basically, this is a fork of the now discontinued feed reader. And I just did some patches to make it follow the elementary theme, and now I maintain this app. And I also maintain a Figma community UI kit for elementary OS. So you can use this kit for designing mockups for elementary OS applications. I also maintain an app icon template. And my latest project is that I'm working with the Owncast team. So we are planning on doing like a UI facelift. So we are building a design system and brand resources for the Owncast UI. So let's start with the presentation. So why design? So why is design important, especially in the open source space? So design helps us identify what the users actually need. So for example, if we as developers, we only design an app by ourselves, we are designing the app according to our own methodologies, and we don't really communicate with our users. So we end up not having an idea about how other users think about our app. So design lets us identify what actual problems that other people are facing, and so that developers can actually work on solving those problems and helping people. So and another thing is that design lets us generate original ideas. So for example, if we communicate with our users and then we come across a problem that we want to solve. So so by good design practices, we can basically come up with features that might solve the problem in a very innovative way, and that can end up helping the overall other platforms such as GNOME, Elementary OS, KDE, Mac OS, Windows, etc. So design is important for properly understanding a problem and then coming up with solutions and with new solutions if they don't exist in the space yet. Okay, so design helps us come up with production pipelines, and this is important because if we design the production pipeline in if we manage it before like jumping into development for our app, so if we plan everything in advance, then this really takes the load off developers, and this really makes the development process much smoother. And developers don't really need to worry about designing like each button, designing how a text field should look. So if all of these things are handled first, so if we follow a proper production plan, then this basically streamlines the development process. So for example, like in my own apps, sometimes I code a feature and then I push it to production. And then I receive feedback from users saying that, hey, this feature is not really working for me that way. So then I'm kind of lazy because I've already hard coded that feature and I need to go back and then redo it again. So that kind of messes up the process. So a good production should prevent that. Okay. So design in the open source space. So how many times have we heard this thing that I am an open source advocate, but I don't use open source app X because it is not usable enough for me? And thinking about this is actually a pretty valid statement because let's say if someone is like 10 times more efficient on another app and his livelihood depends on it, why would he switch to a new app and then learn its workflow? And probably if it lacks features, why would that person adjust to that new app if he is already much faster and more importantly, his earning depends on it? Okay, so design lets us build easy to use interfaces, and especially if we are able to come up with innovative features that will of course attract new users. So if we manage to build programs that are easy to use as well as solve problems in innovative ways and ways which are helpful for the wider community in general, that is going to help us help more and more people adopt open source apps in their day-to-day lives. So now we are going to talk about the process. So I'll be demonstrating some patterns and guidelines and methodologies that we can follow for designing our applications. So yeah, and disclaimer that all of these patterns have been mentioned, and like a very low budget or even a zero budget has kept in mind. So if you don't have, then like even so if your budget is still very low, yeah, you can still apply these patterns, and hopefully these will help you to build more streamlined experiences for your users. So first up is the research phase. So what we can do is we can use software such as Google Forms, and we can also use other things like Buddybase and Oh My Forms, etc. Buddybase is an open source platform which lets you self-host your own forms, and also you can use it in the cloud on Buddybase servers. And the advantage of using Buddybase is that it gives you a lot more customizability for your form. So we can use these tools to basically communicate with our users and have an idea of what problems they are facing, and if they think like us, or we can have an idea of their thinking. And this basically lets us create an empathy map of our users so that we properly understand their problems, and then we can list them so that we can work on them one by one. Okay, so what questions should we ask in forms? For example, forms let us verify our own problems. For example, let's say we have a problem, and we are not really sure if other people feel that that is a problem. So we don't really know if other people think if it's a feature, or if other people think that if it's a bug. So we can ask questions related to that in our forms, and that will give us access to how the other people think about that problem. Another thing is that we can use these forms to gather up statistical data. For example, let's say we are doing some research on if users open an app using the dock, or if they use the applications menu for opening the app. So we can have statistical data on how many people use a particular feature, how many people don't use that particular feature, how many people think that that feature is a bug, how many think that is not a bug. So we can get some pretty useful statistical data through forms. And the other thing, and the most important thing, is that communicating with other users through the means of forms gives us like real insight into what problems are other people's facing, because that is the most important thing that an app should try to solve. For example, like as I mentioned before, that if we design an app as per our own thinking, then the app will only solve our problems, but it will not solve our users' problems. So communicating with users and understanding their problems, empathizing with them, and using proper design methodologies can really help us elevate the experience for our users. Okay, so these are some examples of the kind of statistical data that we can gather through use of form software. So on the left, you can see there is a personal medical app project that I'm working on. And on the right, that is an example of a recent elementary user study. So now it comes to user testing. So this is probably the most important part and the most helpful part of the design research process. So basically, it is like we should provide the experiences that we create to the users so that we can have a direct look at how the other people view those interfaces and how they interact with our interface. And we don't really need to hard code these features and like create a real app and then provide it to the user so that he can use it. We can just create low fidelity wireframes and mockups, etc., and then we can just show them to users so that they can basically look at it and they can tell us like how they feel about it, if they are understanding our the goal of the interface, if their thoughts and views align with our own thoughts and views. So doing just basic pen and paper sketching is a very easy platform for is a very easy way to uh, do user testing. Another thing is paper prototypes. So paper prototypes basically is an amazing way for developers and designers to communicate how the interaction design of our app works. And so we can basically use paper and pen and paper sketches to show how our app is going to function, like how the animations are going to work, how if a button is going to hide that way, if a button is going to hide towards the right, if how is the slide to unlock animation going to look, etc. So all of this can be easily done very quickly and efficiently through paper prototypes, and this is a very low-cost method of prototyping to users. And this is very fast and efficient as well, and it doesn't require a lot of time, like in high-fidelity prototypes where we use complex software to create like almost real life like experiences. So rather than that, if we are on a low budget and we don't have much time, paper prototypes are a really great way to communicate how the interaction design of the app with our users. So if you want a good guide on how we can approach paper prototyping, you can follow this link. This is a pretty good guide by Google, which shows us how to do paper prototyping. As we talked before, for creating mockups, and we can use pen and paper sketches both for internal testing as well as external testing for our users, and we can of course use them for testing within the development team as well. The next step is building up a design system. So a design system is basically a system that contains everything related to the user interface and the language of the UX copy of the app. For example, how a button should look, how a text field should look, what font is the app going to use, how is the typography going to look, how is the color palette going to behave. So everything comes under a design system. So yeah, so this is an example of a work in progress design system that we are building up for Oncast. So on the left, you can see we are sort of planning to use gray as the general color. Then we have the primary color, which is the purple brand color for Oncast. We have our own error color, a color for success. And then on the right, we are kind of experimenting with how is a button going to look, how is a message bubble going to look. So coming up with a design system really helps us test these designs in the real world with users. So we can create mockups using these components, and then we can show them to users. And if we get the desired feedback we want, we can work with changes on them, and then we can ship them out to production, and developers can start coding on these processes. And this is an example of the typography style for elementary OS. So yeah, and this is an example of the UI kit we made for elementary OS. So you can see we have toolbars and buttons and lists and menus and switches and everything. So a design system so this is part of the elementary OS design system, and we can use these components to build our own applications, and then developers can simply code these into their apps. So now coming up to the tools and resources that we can use for designing. First up, it's Figma. It's the most popular UI slash UX prototyping tool, and Figma has a pretty generous free plan, which is usable for most use cases. But the problem is that Figma is proprietary, and we have other open source alternatives as well. This is Penpot. Penpot is a very promising project, and it can be used in production right now if your needs are pretty basic. But keep in mind that Penpot is still beta, and this is not really ready for stable versions yet. But you can do this but you can still use Penpot for some basic prototyping and mockups, etc. Another exciting app, and this is probably my favorite UX app, is Akira. This is a native GTK app, um, which is being led by Alessandro Castellani, and you can download this app right now from FlatHub. It is available as a Flatpak, or if you're using elementary OS, you can just download it from the elementary app center. So now coming up to the principles and guidelines that we can use for designing our applications. These are the universal principles. Everybody knows about these, like the elements and principles of design, Gestalt laws, Theodore Rams's 10 principles for good design. Like, if you want, you can read these, and this will give you an idea of how to build your experiences, how you can use these laws to design your own applications. But hey, there is a good news that you don't really need to use any of these, because uh, the Korean GNOME human interface guidelines, the elementary human interface guidelines, and the KDE human interface guidelines are good enough that if you follow these guidelines, your app should basically be pretty good. It should be pretty well designed, like especially the GNOME interface guidelines. It is very high detailed, and if you regularly use these platforms, then you have an idea of how each app works. Then you can make some pretty well designed experiences for your users. Now coming up to the conclusion is that we shouldn't think of design as something that is added after a product is completed. We should approach designs as decisions. For example, why does the button look that way? Why is that button situated over there? Why is it not in the bottom right, but rather in the bottom left? Why is the text field this way wide and not this much wide? So all of these things should be considered as design, and these should be handled as we are building the product, but rather than making the product and then applying design to it. We shouldn't really think about it that way. Design should be incorporated into the development process. So this is it. This was a very short presentation. So you can, if you have any question, you can ask me. And these are my social media links. You can contact me over at susie97@mastodon.social, or you can email me at singarajdeep97@gmail.com. And there is my GitHub link, github.com/susie97. So if you want to contact me, you can use these links. Thank you.
Question time.
Yes. Yes, thanks for the talk. I was curious, how do you go about identifying the users you want to do the user survey? And then what kind of sample size are you looking at? Like how many users do you get to get, feedback from?
So it really depends on the scale of your app. For example, if your app is already pushed to some app store, you can just publish. So you can basically build out a small wizard in your app saying that, hey, we are currently doing a user survey and you want to attend that. So you can just basically present that survey inside of your app so that you will know that whatever users are filling up your forms, they are direct users from your app. Or also you can just post them on your social media links, and that way you can have a much more wider audience, but it wouldn't be sure that they are necessarily users of your app or not.
Other questions? Let me check the channels. You may have online questions. We got some requests for debugging help, but that's not what you're looking for. And another question about debugging. Oh, is there Mustafa Ahangarha asks, is there anything particular to consider while designing a free software? That's pretty broad.
I would say the most important thing is to consider the user's problems. So if we know what the problems of the user is, then we can basically work on solving those problems.
All right, know your problems. Anyone else have a problem up there? There's a distinct lack of problems here in the room. Yeah, you can't see us, sorry. But I think we're happy. So we'd like to thank you for giving your talk.